Chapter 1 Review, Part 2. Lesson objectives: distinguish between anecdotal evidence, observational studies, and design experiments. Now, in the last video, we learned about anecdotal evidence. In this video, we're going to look at scientific evidence. In research, we wish to determine how varying the amounts of the explanatory variable, or sometimes this is known as the input variable, or the independent variable, or the X variable, affects the value of the response variable. Response variable can be thought of as the output variable, or as the dependent variable, or as the Y variable. An observational study measures the value of the response variable without attempting to influence the value of either the response or the explanatory variables. That is, in an observational study, the researcher observes the behavior of the individuals in the study without trying to influence the outcome of the study. Confounding in a study occurs when the effects of two or more explanatory variables are not separated. Therefore, any relation that may exist between the explanatory variable and the response variable may be due to some other variable or variables not accounted for in the study. Whenever we have an observational study, we can have confounding. A lurking variable is an explanatory variable that was not considered in the study, but that affects the value of the response variable in the study. In addition, lurking variables are typically related to any explanatory variable considered in the study. Now, we'll look at an example of this in just a minute. If a researcher assigns the individual in a study to a certain group, and then it intentionally changes the value of the explanatory variable and records the value of the response variable for each group, the researcher is conducting a design experiment. The power behind design experiment is that we can control lurking variables so we don't have confounding. So here is a visual of a design experiment. We have a random assignment. One group gets the treatment, another group called the control gets a placebo, and what you are going to do is you're going to compare the results at the end. So everything is kept the same between these two groups, except one gets a treatment and the control does not, gets a placebo. So let's look at the difference between an observational study and a design experiment. In an observational study, the researcher merely observes what is happening or what has happened in the past and tries to draw conclusions based upon these observations. The researcher manipulates by the use of the treatment on the variable and tries to determine how the treatment influences the other variables. Observational studies do not allow the researcher to claim causation, only association. Only a well-designed experiment can prove a cause and effect relationship, because a design experiment can control lurking variables. There's an association between the number of ice creams sold at the beach and the number of drownings. As the number of ice cream cones goes up, the number of drowning goes up. Now, does this mean that the ice creams are causing the drownings? Well, this is an association, so this means this was a observational study they just observed, and there's more likely confounding going on here. So what's a possible lurking variable? Well, the lurking variable is temperature. As the temperature goes up, the number of ice creams cones sold goes up. You have more people at the beach because it's warm, you're going to have more people swim. You have more people swim, you're going to have more drownings. So it's not the ice cream that's causing the number of drownings to go up, it's the temperature. Now let's look at the placebo effect. Want to help balding men keep their hair? Give them a placebo. One study found that 42% of balding men stated they maintained or increased the amount of hair on their heads when they took a placebo. So 42% believed that it helped, but the placebo, there was no medication in it. Another study told 13 people who were very sensitive to poison ivy that the stuff being rubbed on one arm was poison ivy. In fact, it was a placebo, but all 13 broke out in a rash. The stuff rubbed on the other arm really was poison ivy, but the persons were told it was harmless, and only 2 out of 13 developed a rash. Placebo effect is very, very strong in design experiments. Let's look at an example. A typical hour primetime television shows 3 to 5 violent acts. Linking family interviews and police records show a clear association between time spent watching TV as a child and later aggressive behavior. Is this an observational study or design experiment? This is an observational study, as they just observed. There was no treatment, there was no random assignment of this treatment, there was no control group. They just simply observed. What are the explanatory and response variables? The explanatory variable would be the amount of time watching TV as a child, and the response variable would be how they measured the aggressive behavior. Suggest some lurking variables that could explain the aggressive behavior. There could be many lurking variables. One could be the home environment, the social economic status of the family. There's many lurking variables. Let's look at example 2. One study of cell phones and the risk of brain cancer looked at a group of 469 people who had brain cancer. The investigators matched each cancer patient with a person of the same sex, age, and race who did not have brain cancer, and then asked about the use of cell phones. The result, our data suggests that the use of handheld cellular telephones is not associated with the risk of brain cancer. Is this an observational study or an experiment? Again, this is an observational study, even though they tried to control having the same sex, age, and race. There was no treatment and there was no control group. In a design experiment, the treatment has to be randomly assigned and the control group has to be randomly assigned, and that's not this case. This is an observational study. What are the explanatory and response variables? The explanatory would be the use of cell phones, and the response variable would be if they got brain cancer or not. Let's look at our third example. An educational software company wants to compare the effectiveness of its computer animation for teaching cell biology with that of the textbook presentation. The company tests the biological knowledge of each group of first-year college students, then randomly divides them into 2 groups. One group uses the animation, the other studies the text. The company retests all the students and compares the increase in the understanding of cell biology in the 2 groups. Is this an observational study or a design experiment? This is a design experiment, as there was a treatment and a control, and they were randomly assigned. The treatment was the use of the animation, the control was using the text. The explanatory variable is if they use the animation or not, and the response variable would be what they got on the second test. More on experiments. Single blind and double blind. Single blind, individual receiving the treatment does not know what treatment they are receiving. It could be the treatment, it could be the placebo. A double blind, individual getting the treatment and the individual recording the outcome does not know which treatment was administered. In the baldness study, 42% of the placebo group kept or increased their hair, but 86% of the men getting a new drug to fight baldness did so. The drug beats the placebo, so it has something besides the placebo going for it. Of course, the placebo effect is still part of the reason this and other treatments work. Because the placebo effect is so strong, it would be foolish to tell the subjects in the medical experiment whether they are receiving a new drug or a placebo. Knowing they are just getting a placebo might weaken the placebo effect and bias the experiment in favor of the other treatments. So this is single blind. It is also foolish to tell doctors and other medical personnel what treatment each subject received. If they know that the subject is just getting a placebo, they may expect less than if they know the subject is receiving a promising new drug. That's why it's good to be double blind. So if a design experiment is better than an observational study, why don't we always use an experiment? Well, sometimes it's unethical or impossible to assign people to receive a certain specific treatment. Time, money, and effort. Design experiments take more time, more money, and more effort. Certain explanatory variables such as handedness or gender are inherent traits and cannot be randomly assigned. Here's the reading and suggested problems. Thanks for watching.